Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good morning. I'm Fred Kempe. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And thank you for joining us today for what promises to be one of the most important events held on the Balkans in Washington, D.C. in over a decade. And I think this is also illustrated in a lot of reporting that already started taking place yesterday on the presence of the 7 ministers in town and the meetings that they were having, which were reported across the region, if I'm not mistaken, Damon, as very big news. I did say I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I'm also the former member of a board of a newspaper in Belgrade. As a very young journalist, I wandered into Tito's Yugoslavia. I've traveled throughout the Balkans for many years. So I think, like a lot of people in this room, we have a professional interest, a political interest, and personal interest in this region. All too often, we characterize the Balkans as what Bulgarian political scientist Ivan Krastev has called the soft underbelly of Europe. My friends from the Balkans have hated the notion of other people worrying about being Balkanized. We see this as a chance and a place where Europe can be completed. And there are a lot of positive trends in that direction, but it isn't going to happen without a community of influence like our own, working on these issues consistently, over time, intelligently, and not being undertaken by the attention deficit disorder that so often plagues Washington, D.C. We'll stick with these set of issues because we think it's crucial to the transatlantic relationship and crucial for Europe's future. And our dialogue comes at a time when this region is in flux, which conveniently allows me to plug the hashtag for today's event, which is hashtag Balkans Forward. So please join the discussion on social media throughout the day, hashtag Balkans Forward, because indeed, our goal is not to recap troubles past, but look at opportunities future, the viable path to take the Balkans forward. So why are we here in Washington, D.C., discussing events in the Balkans? At the Council, we strongly believe that against a backdrop of change and uncertainty, the United States, the European Union, and the Western Balkans face a real opportunity. Get it right, and we can lead in creating a safe, secure, and prosperous Western Balkans firmly embedded in the West. Get it wrong, and our ambivalence today may engender a crisis tomorrow. Get it right, getting it right will require a combination of efforts, all of which are on the agenda today. We will address the crucial questions of, number one, how can the United States re-engage effectively both on the security and diplomatic fronts? Number two, how can the U.S. and EU work together more effectively to ensure the integration of the region in the Euro-Atlantic community? Three, how do we manage the changing geostrategic landscape in Southeast Europe and the geostrategic landscape that influences Southeast Europe? Four, how do we address the longer-term economic prospects of the region and empower a new generation of investors and entrepreneurs to create economic opportunities for the people of the Western Balkans? That's an area I would love to drill down on more at the Atlantic Council and with all of you. Five, over the past year, the Atlantic Council's Balkans Initiative has brought together the best minds, government officials, members of the business community and startup community, civil society leaders, policy experts, and journalists to tackle these changes. This reflects our own bet on the people of the region, especially on this next generation of entrepreneurs, leaders, and experts. Today is a crucial continuation of this Atlantic Council effort. A special thanks goes out first of all to our partners which have made today's event possible. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Embassy of Switzerland, and our own inimitable Ambassador Robert Gelbard, who is one of the Atlantic Council's own board directors, a member of our executive committee of our board, and key supporter of our Balkans work from the beginning. So thanks, Bob. And thanks to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Embassy of Switzerland. Thank you for your generous support for this forward-looking, solutions-oriented discussion of the Balkans. One last reminder, we're convening this today on the record and webcasting live. So with that, let me turn it over to Damon Wilson, speaking of inimitable, Atlantic Council Executive Vice President, who will set the scene for the discussions to follow.
Thank you very much, Fred. I want to echo Fred's welcome to all of you and invite my colleague Damir Marusic to join me on stage for us to set the scene for today's conversation. Damir is the executive editor at the American Interest, a terrific foreign policy magazine, but also the lead author of our report, along with my colleague Sarah Bedenbaugh, who's here today, and a dedicated group of contributors that are listed in the report, and many of whom are in the room with us now. So many of you traveled to Washington. You arrived here to talk about the Western Balkans. And yet you open up the newspaper and are met with headlines of provocative reports of North Korean missile tests, a missile that could perhaps even reach Washington, D.C. Stories of the Russian peace play in Syria, Saudis playing high stakes on Qatar in Lebanon, President Trump playing high diplomatic stakes with Beijing. We've got a visit ongoing of the EU3 in Washington to think about how to salvage the Iran nuclear deal, and of course very difficult NAFTA negotiations which could reshape the U.S. role in global trade. And yet we're here to talk about the Balkans. This is a heavy agenda in the United States. You may have noticed a big vote on tax reform in the Senate. You may have felt a partisan tinge to the environment here in Washington. In effect, our community is really asking bigger questions about the role of the United States under President Trump. And across the Atlantic, the European Union is debating its own future. And yet our community at the Atlantic Council felt that one of our concerns is that there is uncertainty in the core of our community. It raises risk. It means the potential for instability in the periphery of the transatlantic community. So we wanted to gather today to focus minds on the Western Balkans, with the premise that if we don't, that we have a potential to walk into an unsighted crisis. Ambivalence today could breed a crisis tomorrow. We've seen what a period of disengagement has produced already in the region with the internal crisis we've witnessed over the past couple of years in Macedonia, the attempted coup in Montenegro, paralysis in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But we also believe that the inverse is true. With a little bit of attention and effort, a little bit of strategy, there's an opportunity. It's not clear that the same recipe will continue to work. In fact, it's probably clear that business as usual is not the way forward. But we do, as Fred said, want to use today to focus on the future. What is the way forward in the United States in a supporting role with the European Union and their partners in the region to map a more positive future? So we want to take a moment at the beginning of this conference to help set the scene. Let me turn to Damir to continue this.
Thanks, Damon. Fred talked about and Damon did as well, about looking forward. But I'd like to just look at the past a little bit, because working on this report, I was really struck by how important it is to examine the framework of how we talk about the past before we talk about the future. The three elements that I think are familiar to most people in this room about how the region is generally talked about. There's a kind of romanticism, maybe most familiar to readers of Rebecca West, that portrayed the region as an incomprehensible kind of place. Another thing that sort of came out of that during the Balkan Wars was this idea of ancient hatreds that beset the land. And tied to that conception also is this idea that the Balkans are a tinderbox for Europe. Again, this idea comes out of the fact that World War I started in Sarajevo. The history of the conflict, I think, is, again, pretty familiar, but let me just illustrate my point pretty quickly about how this framework matters. When was it? I think 1992, Secretary of State James Baker said, we don't have a dog in this fight, as hostilities were spooling up there. And this stands in for this idea of ancient hatreds. By mid-decade, the West was involved, spurred on by the horrors of the conflict. And by the time Dayton was being hammered out, the West was fully engaged. But still, what was the underlying, call it, impetus for this engagement was still this idea that it's the tinderbox of Europe, and this needs to be solved in order that violence doesn't spread further. By 2003, you have a different sort of mood takeover, I'd say. At the EU Thessaloniki summit, the ideas, the whole frame is much more forward-looking, and this becomes a new sort of hopeful approach for the Balkans. A European future is sketched out, and the peace dividend borne out by Thessaloniki is very real. You had Slovenia and Albania and Croatia joining NATO, Slovenia and Croatia then joining the EU. And the fact is that the rationale, the sort of historical framework then, also embedded in itself this idea that events, history had a direction, and the future of Europe would basically impel the actors in the region to solve a lot of the problems, and that things would kind of take care of themselves. But in the 2000s, the United States with Afghanistan and Iraq became distracted, and by 2014, the European Union itself is much more inward-looking. European Commissioner Jean-Claude Juncker in 2014 walked back the idea of Thessaloniki in not insubstantial way. So then you've seen recently, I think, a series of crises that have erupted in the region. They're reasonably telegenic. I mean, you'll hear about them today, discussed in many ways. But what I would like to basically, the other crisis that you'll see come up, and again, Fred mentioned this, is this idea that the European Union, the Balkans become sort of a target for foreign power meddling. We have China and Turkey, obviously, but as well as that, you have the impact of Russia in the region. Damon's about to talk more about the sort of future and going forward, but I'd just like to, again, sort of take a step back and talk about this framing issue that I started talking about. Basically, the EU whole and free is a concept. It's basically the liberal world order, the post-war liberal world order in microcosm. And I'd like to encourage you all to think about the Balkans as also this in microcosm. When we look at the issues that plague the Balkans, and since the 1990s, questions of identity, populism, corruption, migrant issues, these are the same issues that are besetting the European Union and the West more broadly today. I just like to encourage everyone as we go forward today to think about not the Balkans as some kind of problem child, but as a shared set of problems that all of us face together. And it's in that spirit that I'd like to, we approach today and the future going forward and the strategies. Damon?
Terrific. Thanks, Damir. So let's recall as we talk about the way forward that it's not as if we've not had a strategy. There was a very clear original strategy that out of the ashes of the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, the transatlantic managed to forge a common vision and a strategy to back it up, a Europe whole, free, and at peace, inclusive of the Western Balkans. And this was built on forging a strategic partnership with Russia, on former adversaries becoming allies through the process of NATO enlargement, and on the deepening of Europe and the European Union. And the Balkans was to benefit from each of these. And yet each of these pillars has hit a pretty significant roadblock today. So we therefore want to talk about the future, new elements of a strategy. So we go back to first principles in our report. We want to talk about reestablishing the clarity of vision, the clarity of strategy. This idea in 2003, the Thessaloniki Declaration, that the future of the Balkans is in the European Union, and that we need to really embrace an update of that today, in which the United States joins with the EU to back the concept of full integration into our community and its institutions, with the European Union in a lead role, but the U.S. role critical. with Washington, working closely with Brussels, and I'd add particularly with Athens, to help build out this vision with Greece as a partner in this greater vision in the region. Second, we focus on security. Obviously, the role of the alliance and NATO remains core, especially the prospect of the viability of the open doors we've seen so recently with Montenegro. But our group also argues that we should be thinking more strategically about establishing and sustaining a permanent security presence in the region. Much as we're reconsidering the force structure of US forces, NATO forces in the northeast of Europe, how do we parallel that in the southeast of Europe, perhaps with some of the European Defense Initiative funding? And that we begin to transition that ends the paradigm of this concept of how do we draw down our forces in KFOR, where the US still has about 675 troops. And we transition to the concept of an enduring, permanent presence in the region, whether based out of Camp Bondstill or perhaps Tuzla in Bosnia, with the concept that we're there to project continued American influence, to support capacity building in the region, to incentivize regional cooperation, and to hedge for crisis response as needed. The third plank is to pursue a historic reconciliation with Serbia. It doesn't mean that anyone's particularly wedded to the idea of strongmen or this concept of stability, but to signal that as Belgrade and as President Vučić makes the decisive choice for Serbia's future, that he has a committed partner in Washington as well as Brussels. And indeed, we've seen President Vučić make an early visit here to Washington and join political capital at home to take some of these risks. And I think the premise of this is that we have to remember, after all, the whole concept of the European project was the process of former adversaries becoming allies. Doesn't mean historic amnesia. We have to recognize and accept the past. But as importantly, it means a commitment to building a shared future together. The third plank is US reenergized role in the diplomatic game. Now, I don't want to imply that we've been out. We have dedicated diplomats at the State Department who have been working crises in and out over recent years. But the concept for us is how at the beginning of a new administration to engage and signal at a political level that we're going to help provide some extra impetus to key diplomatic maneuvers. Vice President Pence's visit was a welcome early engagement. The idea of helping to reestablish the US as an honest broker with a commitment to development, not just stability. And that we think about an intentional strategy to help Montenegro succeed as our newest ally, both as it faces external influence in its upcoming presidential election and disruption of its path towards the EU. That we mobilize behind recent progress in Albania on its path towards the European Union. That we try to figure out how to play the right supporting role in what's become a historic opportunity in Macedonia as it aims to get back on track. That the United States joins the European Union actively in supporting the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, helping to arrive at clarity of what the end game is. And with a view towards the NATO summit next summer, that we help prepare Macedonia and Greece to become future allies, hence engaging Athens in our entire comprehensive strategy so that there are decision makers prepared to take tough decisions on particular issues when the time comes. And the fifth plank is the issue of a shift to focus on prosperity. In some respects, cross-border issues, the idea of how do we actually facilitate cross-border infrastructure projects that marry the EU's Berlin process with the 3Cs process so that as infrastructure is being built in the region, it integrates the region into Europe, especially in the realm of energy security. But I think as importantly, this issue of entrepreneurship. And how do we actually support in our community entrepreneurs in the region so that they find sources of income that are outside of political patronage networks, that we leverage the advance of a digital economy to provide opportunities for individuals, that we help support a regulatory environment that benefits small and medium enterprises over state-owned enterprises, and that we take a bet, as Fred said, on the next generation that helps cease the brain drain, attracts talents back, recognizes the vibrant role that civil society has to play, that recognizes the power of open source intelligence even in the region to hold leaders accountable, to help prepare a new wave of leaders in politics and the economy. So I want to close as we move into the conference today with the idea that I think there is potentially an opportunity for the United States with the European Union. Yes, we've got an administration that's really challenging the EU with its way forward on Paris, climate, Iran, trade. We've got a European Union that's focused on the future of itself in the wake of Brexit, We're trying to watch Germany form a government today. Yet there is an opportunity to forge a common strategy, which has been the ingredient of our recipe all along in the Western Balkans, but to do so in a way that recognizes that there might be a bankrupt model on the ground, this nexus of corruption, politics, and crime, that the problem is perhaps the nature of the system and not any particular leader or party, and that we've got an obstacle to many of these objectives because of vested interest. So how can the United States and Europe come together now, not business as usual, not with a conventional bureaucratic process, but to restore the incentives and leverage, the viability of a European future, the offer of prosperity and security, which brings to the table sharpened tools on governance, whether it's the US thinking creatively about application of the Global Magnitsky Act, or the EU reapplying its tools on the corruption index. We've seen examples of transitions, whether historically in Italy or more recently in Romania, that offer a viable path forward. So I'm going to close today with the sense of reminding why we're here, that we're working with a community of people to help develop a set of elements of a strategy that help demonstrate renewed US engagement in support of the European Union, to forge a new deal with actors in the region about their future. But second, that we actually help coalesce this community that's in this room and that's watching online around key ideas and key efforts to advance these proposals. And that we demonstrate through our works and action here that the United States is engaged, that our influence and engagement is a consistent presence in the region and back in your home markets. So with that, we're going to begin the conference. I want to thank all of you for joining, many of you who've come across the Atlantic, and a particular thanks to the European Union and our colleague who is going to kick off the conference with some opening remarks, Christian Leffler, who is the Deputy Secretary General for Global and Economic Issues in the European External Action Service, who is a leader on so many issues within the European Union. We're grateful for you joining us in Washington for this conversation and look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for asking me to join this event. Sadly, I will not be able to stay throughout the day to listen to the contributions and to the discussion, but I'm confident that I have enough friends and spies in the room who will then tell me afterwards what happened. So I look forward to hearing the readout as well. Let me take as a starting point the remarks made by both Damir and Damon on Europe whole and free, the vision of where we want to get to and what kind of Europe we want to see, which goes to the very core of what the European Union is about. It's about Europe, it's about the peoples of Europe, and it's about trying to bring them together in a greater and stronger community. The Balkans, the Western Balkans, have an obvious place in that vision. And if there were any doubts about it earlier on, since Thessaloniki 2003, there have been no doubts. There are no doubts. There are challenges. It's a difficult path. There's a lot of work. But the objective is to continue to progress on the project of creating a larger, stronger union, whole and free. That depends also, and there are some of the challenges and difficulties, on the whole and free Europe being safe, secure, and confident. Confident from the countries that participate. Confident from the peoples in their governments, in their authorities, both in the way they manage their own affairs and in the way they contribute to this larger process. So working with the countries of the Balkans and the peoples of the Balkans to advance towards that goal is very, very much not just an interest of the European Union, it's a necessity. The Balkans are there, they're part of a community of destiny, they are part of geography, they are a bridge between current members where there is a gap in the map, which gradually we'd like to see filled. There has been progress. There has been a lot of work done. 2017, this year, has shown renewed focus on and engagement with the countries of the Balkans. It's been a challenging year, still is, for some of the countries, but we do find overall that the region is in better shape now towards the end of the year than it was at the beginning of the year. The EU member states, in the early months of this year, at the European Council in March 2017, reiterated the unequivocal commitment of the EU to integrating the Western Balkans as and when they wish, the countries of the Western Balkans, as and when they wish and as and when they are capable of taking on the responsibilities of membership, integrating them into the EU. President Juncker, in his September State of the European Union speech to the European Parliament, was also very clear for this perspective for the countries of the Western Balkans. President of the Commission underlined that the door of the European Union is open to further accessions once the countries have met all the criteria. That's the fundamental and inalterable condition. I therefore don't agree that there was a walkback in 2014 by President Juncker. This is not a change of heart. In 2014, as he took up office, he stated the obvious. There was not going to be any effective enlargement in the course of his mandate because there's no country that is ready before the end of 2019. There's no country that is actually will be capable of taking on the responsibilities that go with membership. But we're working to make it possible, and we're working to make sure that the timelines can be clarified. This indeed is the explicit vision of High Representative Vice President Federica Mogherini, who said that she wants to see all the Western Balkan partners take concrete steps in this direction before the end of her mandate, end of 2019, in order to make the path towards full integration into the European Union irreversible. Quite a lot will happen next year, particularly in the first half of next year, to move us along that path. We believe we do have a real historic opportunity, and we will work closely with our partners in the region, outside the region, United States and others, as well, of course, as with our member states, to make sure that we make full use of these opportunities. In February next year, the External Action Service and the Commission will present a new strategy, a new policy paper, to clarify what we need to do to live up to this vision of President Juncker and the High Representative Federica Mogherini, in terms of opening up EU policies further to the countries of the region, how to enhance our interaction with the partners in the Western Balkans, with the countries, with the governments, with the administrations, and with the people of the region. How one can give them better insight into, better opportunities to input into EU decision-making processes, and how to enhance and strengthen the support that we give to them. A month or a couple of months later, in April, there will be the usual annual enlargement package, enlargement process assessment from the European Commission. That will allow us a stock taking of where we've actually got to in the talks with the different countries of the region. And the following month, in May, there will be a Western Balkans summit hosted by the rotating presidency next spring, Bulgaria, where all 28 member states, together with the 6 Western Balkans countries, will have an opportunity to discuss both the strategy paper and the progress assessment that will have been published in the months before. We hope very much that that Sofia summit will play a pivotal role in making more concrete the renewed strategic engagement and focus on the Western Balkans, and in doing so, it will send a strong signal about the common European perspective that we are pursuing. But the spring, the first semester, is not over yet. In June, following that Balkan summit, we expect the European Council, so the heads of state and government of the EU, again to look at the Balkans issue and formulate conclusions which presumably will reiterate and make more explicit what they said in March this year, and which goes back and is still founded on the vision set out in Thessaloniki in 2003. I believe that for the Western Balkans, joining the EU is both a logical and a strategic choice. The EU is already the largest trading partner and the largest investor in the region. It's also, by quite a long shot, the largest supporter in terms of financial assistance and technical cooperation. That is probably not visible enough, and it shows in the opinion polls about general support for the process of moving closer to the EU, as well as people's perceptions of who does what. When asked who are the largest supporters financially of the Balkans, most people in the Western Balkans say, and I believe it's in that order, first the United States. I leave that to you to judge. Secondly, Russia. I don't quite know who should judge that. Thirdly, Japan, and then fourth, the EU. So we clearly have a bit of a public relations job to do. That is reflected to some degree in the overall polls on support for accession to the EU, but generally those figures do show a strong public base, going from around 50% in the most reluctant, or maybe reluctant is not the right word, but the most cautious, to 85% in the most enthusiastic. We're used to that. Usually when you start negotiating, people are hugely enthusiastic, and then they see all the challenges and difficulties. So by the time they might be asked in a referendum to join, we usually hit rock bottom, and then it starts going back up again, except in one country, which we're not talking about today. Making sure that we can make this progress towards the strategic goal. Rule of law remains absolutely fundamental. It is the basis for much of the work in other areas, and it's difficult to imagine progress in other areas, be it political, economic, or administrative, unless there is real progress and consolidation on fundamental rule of law issues. Because they come not just to the heart of what it is to be an efficient and accountable state, but they come to the heart of what the European Union is about, as a union based on law, serving the interests of the people. That is why we follow with interest, with great attention, and with some considerable concern, developments in some countries in the Western Balkans, including current developments, such as the developments in the last few days in Skopje with the arrest and then release of a number of MPs. That is the sort of matter which we hope and expect to be able to clarify in close and frank dialogue with the authorities, in this case of that country, but other similar examples too. Another element, which is obviously very important to us as well as to the region itself, is regional cooperation. There has been remarkable progress in recent years. There are now regular regional meetings at all levels of government, prime ministers, other ministers, officials. For example, there was the dinner of the 6 prime ministers in Durrës last August and in New York in September. HRVP Mogherini intends to convene them, invite them to another dinner before the end of this year to see how we can make sure that we take this process forward at the highest level. Now, moving beyond the region and beyond the EU relations with the region, there is no more important partner for us in this venture than the United States. The United States has always been a key partner for the European project ever since it was launched, working towards that Europe whole and free, working on the security, the politics, the economics, the trade, and all the other aspects of the future of Europe and the European Union. I don't believe that this was done in some great fit of American altruism. I don't believe in altruism in international relations. This is very clearly also in the interest of the United States to have a strong, stable, open, democratic partner in the European Union. And a pretty successful endeavor that has been for both of us as well. That strong and enduring partnership between the US and the EU in addressing the challenges that we face in the Western Balkans has been and remains essential to success in aiding the region to move forward on its path to the future they design for themselves. I'd like to believe that our joint efforts have contributed to the important progress shown in the region in recent months. But it's very clear, and you will have the opportunity to discuss it during the day, that there's an awful lot more that needs to be done. The High Representative Vice President, Mrs. Mogherini, is in very regular contact with Vice President Pence and, of course, Secretary of State Tillerson on issues pertaining to the region. And both the External Action Service and the European Commission have very close and confident cooperation with our US counterpart in State Department and elsewhere. One well-known example is the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue on normalization of relations between Serbia and Kosovo. It's a good example of pretty much seamless cooperation between the US and the EU. The process is facilitated, convened by the EU, convened personally by the High Representative Vice President, given notably the EU perspective on both sides, that Europe whole and free again. But it is and has been since its inception in 2011 a joint project that has been planned, prepared and executed as such by the EU and the US together. The continued input and support by the US is a crucial factor in the success of that dialogue. The HRVP is now engaging the two sides on preparing for what we hope will be a comprehensive and final phase as an essential element in moving forward on that path towards integration into the EU of both Serbia and Kosovo. It should be clear that the EU is committed to continue facilitating this dialogue during the next critical period for the process as well as for the prospects of Serbia's accession as frontrunner in the enlargement process together with Montenegro. In this respect, we were a bit surprised to see that Prime Minister Haradinaj seems to now consider a visible presence of the US in the meetings of this process as a criterion for Kosovo for the successful outcome of the dialogue. Why this change of heart? We're not sure. We think one of the main strengths of the process so far has been the steady but discreet US input and the focus on the EU as a convener because of that accession perspective, which brings the interests of Kosovo and Serbia together. I think it would be useful and helpful if the US and the EU together can give the new Kosovo PM the reassurance through familiarization with the process of the established way of taking the dialogue forward, so that we can take it with strong lead both from the Kosovo side and the Serbian side forward in this next essential phase. Going beyond our bilateral relationship and bilateral cooperation between the EU and the US, we've also been working very hard in some of our shared regional contexts, notably NATO, to strengthen the partnership in how we work on security issues in the Western Balkans. Those of you who looked at the EU-NATO joint declaration signed at the NATO summit in Warsaw in July 2016 will have seen that there are a number of new areas of deeper engagement by the EU and NATO together in the Western Balkans. I know I've spoken too long already, and let me therefore just make a few last remarks to sum up my message as a kickoff from the EU side. From our side, from the side of the EU, there is the commitment, the engagement, and the focus on the Western Balkans to realize the full potential for the region in its relationship with the EU, and indeed in designing its broader future as well. The EU institutions and our member states are working hard to realize the objective of the integration of the countries of this region into the Union. It will not be easy. Enlargement processes never are. It will not be easy for the EU. It will not be easy for the countries concerned. But there is a clear way forward. And we believe we do have not just that political will, but also the practical, technical, and institutional tools to make it possible. It will be challenging, and we count on the US and other partners, but notably the US, to continue working closely with us to take this bit of the European puzzle forward, to build this bit of the European future in the Western Balkans, with the Western Balkans, and for the Western Balkans, as part of the long-term ambitious project for the unification or reunification of Europe in our shared interest. Ultimately, however much we work together, the United States and the EU, that future and the realization of this potential lies in the hands of the Western Balkans themselves. We can help, we can support, we can encourage, we can even sometimes cajole, but we cannot design or realize that future for them. I believe it is a common responsibility of all of us, foremost of the 6 countries, the governments and authorities of the 6 countries of the Western Balkans, but beyond that, of all of us, in the efforts to realize the benefits, the potential of that Europe, whole and free. That is a common responsibility that we have towards the people of the Balkans. Thank you.